Welcome to Plough Quarterly's online event, Dependence. No man or woman is an island, and no one should aspire to be one either. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us for this event this evening. Very warm welcome to our panelists who will be part of tonight's discussion. I'm joined by Leah Libresco Sargeant, Noah van Niel, Atar Hadari, and Peter Mommsen. I'll do proper introductions later as we get to that. My name is Ian Bart. I'm the UK editor of Plough Quarterly. Before we go further, a little bit about who Plough Quarterly is. We are a magazine of stories, ideas, and culture to inspire faith and action. In addition to the quarterly magazine, we also put a lot of articles online, publish books, and put on events. We come from a unique Christian perspective. We are not tribal or party political. We are very keen to find common ground with all people, regardless of faith or background. And above all, we're interested in encouraging discussion about how to make the world a better place. Please check us out online, and please subscribe to the magazine. It's not expensive. We'll be very happy that you did. Now, a little bit about how we'll be running the evening tonight. If you look at in the online chat section of your screen, we'll be posting links to the articles that we mentioned. And if you have any questions, you can type those in. We'll be having a Q&A session toward the end of the evening, and hopefully we'll get to some of your questions. So to get into the theme of tonight's discussion, dependence, not a terribly glamorous theme. We have a cultural idea of success that rewards people who are independent, autonomous, who are true to themselves, whatever that means, in which the rights of the individual trump all other considerations. The message society gives us is that happiness and fulfillment are directly linked to independence. That fulfillment means I decide what I want for my life. The purpose of the discussion we're having this evening is to give the lie to this perspective. In the first place, we're never truly independent. And secondly, because independence is not linked directly to either happiness or fulfillment. The theme of the winter issue of Plough Quarterly is what are families for? I have a copy here for those people who haven't seen it. Really great issue, and covers a number of great topics. Just to mention a couple of those. Great article about families having one more child. A beautiful article from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, The Story of Marriage, and an article about extended families, families that are more than nuclear. But there's another theme that the magazine covers really well, and that is the theme of interdependence. We're lucky enough to have 4 contributors from the last issue of Plough Quarterly with us on the panel tonight, and each of them addresses this theme from a slightly different angle. The catalyst for the discussion tonight was an article by Leah Libresco Sargeant titled Dependence Toward an Illiberalism of the Weak. Leah is a writer on topics covering religion, statistics, and theater. She's written for First Things, The American Conservative, Commonweal, and Plough Quarterly. Leah, it's great to have you with us as our main speaker tonight. Please tell us a little bit about your article and why you wrote it.
Thank you so much. A lot of why I wanted to write this is because when we talk about politics, whether at the level of political philosophy or at the level of politics as it's practiced, how we decide who to vote for, what policies to support, where to get involved in our local community, a question that's really lurking behind all that is, what's the basic unit of our society? And what is the basic state of human beings? The liberal tradition of politics, going all the way back to John Locke, kind of starts from the individual. Everyone exists one by one, making semi-voluntary connections to each other. And that when we talk about our policies, we think about them as they affect the scale of the individual, person by person. And what's the basic state of a human being? It's someone who's autonomous. It's someone who can stand on their own, doesn't need to rely on other people. And where that isn't true, we want to elevate people to that state. We want to say, oh, you seem like you're dependent on others. What can we do so that that doesn't have to be true for you anymore? So you can be free to be alone. I really reject this as a view of who humans are. I don't think it's descriptively true of who humans are. And I think even if it weren't true of who we are right now, it's a bad goal for our politics and our polity. When we look at what our lives are like, everyone starts their life dependent. My baby, who very graciously has chosen to take a nap during this panel. I'm in the US, so it's a little late for nap time, but I'm very grateful. Began her life completely dependent on me in the womb. Everything that she received as sustenance, she received through me, not even by my active choice, but just because of the connection between us. So the very beginnings of human life are themselves relationships of complete dependence, of complete relation to someone else. And there's nothing that magically happens when a baby is born, besides the fact that my baby, who's still at a year old, extremely dependent on her father and me, can now acquire sustenance both at meals, as she tries out solid foods, and even before that can experiment with whether anything on the floor might in fact be intended for her good. And even there, she's dependent, to be tutored by us about whether everything in the world is edible or not. But we talk as though childhood, infancy, toddlerhood, every part of, I don't know how far we want to take this, 7 years old, the age of reason, college maybe, that's all a rounding error in human experience. It doesn't count. It's true that when you're a child, when you're a toddler, when you're an infant, when you're in the womb, you're dependent on others. But sooner or later, you graduate and then you become a full person. And because we know you'll become a full person eventually, it's all right to treat you like a person now, even though technically you don't qualify. But we all have faith in you. And thus, we're willing to kind of advance our respect for you forward a little, even though you technically don't deserve it. That's what our culture of autonomy says. It says children really, they're not fully people. They don't have the full dignity of autonomy, but we're just going to slip it to them, a little bit. And when the going gets tough, maybe that support is actually a little conditional. We face the same problem at the end of life. When the aged reach a certain point of weakness and inability, some doctors and ethicists are as ready to deny personhood at the end of life as they are at the beginning. Once people become sufficiently physically frail, once they become sufficiently mentally feeble, we start to say, well, if being a person means being on your own, at what point do you slide out of our circle of care and out of our ranking of who is a person? And once again, there's kind of that sense that, well, maybe that middle of autonomy, elevates this. You may be sick and old and weak now, but you had a period of autonomy. So we'll just let it kind of have a little penumbra that covers this embarrassing but unusual period of weakness and count you as a person for a little bit longer because of all those deposits you made in your personhood during the period you could stand on your own. This is monstrous. This is monstrous and it's ludicrous at the same time. Because of course that middle period isn't itself a period of total autonomy. Everyone has periods throughout their life, even the hardiest, most kind of Olympic level athlete, simply of illness, of tiredness, of sorrow, of times when we are not autonomous and cannot stand on our own. And although we're told and again, those are passing phases where we go through a rough patch and then return to autonomy, it would be much truer to say that dependence is our default state and self-sufficiency the temporary aberration. Our lives begin and end in states of near total dependence, and most of the middle is marked by prolonged periods of need. But when we push this idea aside, not only are we tempted to make monstrous ethical decisions, ones we've seen come to the fore again during our current COVID pandemic, where there are questions about who deserves care and whose life is worth saving, where we are truly strained, and facing questions of how to prioritize care, but people whose job is to consider philosophy and to consider ethics are very quick to write off the most vulnerable as the least worthwhile because of that vulnerability. Because the idea doesn't create a greater demand on all of us for the sake of justice, but rather distances the vulnerable for us and makes them more different and alien to us all. But even in times that aren't of crisis, hating dependence is itself a crisis and puts us all at risk. A fear and hatred of weakness and dependence, first of all, create a danger for the people who experience prolonged or chronic weakness, the disabled, the elderly, the unborn, the ill, all of whom feel that their hold on our sympathies is to an extent tenuous, or it has to be earned by saying, well, I may be weak, but I occasionally do an exceptional thing, or I occasionally push myself. And if I just do that often enough, I guess you might count me as a person on that basis, just as we kind of allow the elderly and infants to make that claim on the basis of things they have done or will do. But it also creates a real danger for the people who are strong at the present, because it creates a temptation to lie about who we are, that even the people who are strong at the moment, when we see how the weak are treated, we learn that we must hide our own weakness, even from the people we love, because if we reveal it, we won't be lovable anymore. We won't be valuable anymore. We won't be people anymore. And not only does that fray and damage our relationship with other human beings who are secretly, like all of us, subject to profound and prolonged periods of weakness, it creates a real rift in our relationship with God. A relationship with God has to be founded on truth and acknowledging the truth of who He is and who we are as dependent creatures. And if our interactions with the people in our lives here on earth teach us day by day to hide our weakness and to be ashamed of it, we won't be ready to bring that weakness to God, to acknowledge who we are, and to ask for help, and to acknowledge who He is in sustaining us. Our physical weakness is to a certain extent a training ground for a much more profound weakness, of moral weakness. And the more, again, that we are ashamed of or deny or cast out the people whose physical weakness cannot be denied, the more we leave no room to talk for the more difficult struggles with moral weakness we all also face. There is no physical infirmity we can endure that's more humiliating than our susceptibility to sin. The elderly woman with tremors that leave her unable to lift a cup to her lip is not, in the final sense, weaker than any vigorous young man who finds he must echo Paul and say, I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. There's no period of physical health any of us experience that's unmarked by those periods of moral frailty and moral weakness. And to a certain extent, our physical weakness, by virtue of being more undeniable, by virtue of not being able to be rationalized away as easily, forces us to confront the fact that we are often insufficient for the things we want to do and are, in fact, dependent on others. Physical weakness can be a training ground for practicing asking others for help, for practicing admitting our own insufficiency and seeking the support we need or the training we need to be equal to what's asked of us, or admitting that we're not, recruiting others to come to our aid. And in the absence of that training, it's much harder to face up to the subtler difficulty of moral weakness, the more important thing to ask for help about. But if you find that you're ashamed or embarrassed to ask your friend to come over to take care of you when you have the flu, how will you go to your friend when you've betrayed them or betrayed someone else you love or fallen short of your duties to them as a friend and say, here I am, weak, insufficient, I need your help to be better, and I think I can ask for that help without rupturing our relationship. A world founded on weakness can value strength not as the possession of just an individual alone, but as a common resource that we all draw on. In his book, The Gift, Lewis Hyde talks about an economy of a sort of constant sloshing around of gifts, that there's a natural flow to the gifts we've been given, like water going from high to low, that what we have is meant to be passed on and shared without keeping very close accountancy books all the time. And to an extent, because of those differing periods of dependence from youth to middle age to older age, most of us will find that if we check the balance books mostly balance, that many of us, if we commit ourselves to care for whoever is weak in our life, will find that the care we receive roughly to an order of magnitude parallels it. But at the same time, there will be people for whom they've been given abundant gifts and fewer obvious weaknesses and find they are primarily giving to others, or people who suffer from real dependencies and are primarily receiving. And what Hyde reminds us, and what the whole gospel reminds us, is there's nothing odd or unjust about that world. There's no sense in which the strong are being bilked or the weak are taking what they don't deserve. Justice is giving to each of us what we need. And more than justice, being part of a community is getting to enter into joyfully the responsibility of caring for each other. To distance yourself from that communal, joyful sloshing of gifts and love and time isn't to make yourself richer by hoarding what you have. It's to make yourself a stagnant pond, lacking inflows and outflows, lacking connection to others, and of course, lacking any knowledge of who you really are and what you're made to be. Ultimately, our goal is a fully just society which has to be founded on truth. And the truth of who we are is people who are not our own, people who are not made to be alone, and people whose very weaknesses and crosses are meant to be the bridges that connect us to each other by virtue of our dependence, making us known to each other and letting ourselves be known to God. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. I really like that image of the stagnant pond. I think that puts it very well. Our next speaker is Noah van Niel. Noah is a graduate of Harvard University, where he was a starter on the varsity football team. After college, he spent a few years pursuing a career as an opera singer before following God's call to the priesthood. Noah is currently serving as the associate rector at Chapel of the Cross in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. He's written an article for Plough in this last issue titled "Manly Virtues: Can Masculinity Be Good?" Noah, in your piece, you talk about toxic masculinity as something which is really damaging to everybody. How do you see this linking into the discussion we're having this evening?
Great, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Leah, for setting this up so beautifully and so thoughtfully. I really appreciate that. I was thrilled when I got this invitation to make the connection between these pieces, because I think there's much ground that that Leah covers from the sort of background that then gets really focused and only heightened in its difficulty when it comes to masculinity, particularly within the Christian world, but even more broadly than that. And I think this idea of independence is glorified as something that men should aspire to, and that this sort of a sense of being a strong individual who does not depend on anyone else, has completely self-sufficient, self-reliance, rugged individualism, all those phrases that get thrown around to sort of lift up what we think a man should be, suffer the same downsides that Leah just outlined. And I think for me as a man, and for men more broadly, it's really important to bring out this conversation about the values of weakness and fragility, because I think essentially that is a place that we need to discover or rediscover for ourselves. I think where it becomes a problem is not so much that, learning to sort of be your own person is a bad thing, but we tend to push this beyond just sort of, being an individual into being sort of isolated from other individuals. And there's this extension or an extreme that we push people to say that to be autonomous is to not really need or even want other people, that you can exist on your own, and that's not just good, but that's what you should be. And so there's a value judgment associated with it, as Leah was pointing out. And I think for men, that has been true for a long time and has led to this sort of, oftentimes a sort of detach or emotional distance from others, and an unwillingness to confront their own weakness and challenges, such that they don't feel comfortable being there for others who are weak or challenged, or to deal with things that are, you know, mushy or emotional or things like that. So I think that for us, for men speaking here, this idea of dependence is almost salvific, in the sense that if we can reground ourselves in an understanding of who we are as individuals and where our value lies, and that there is this sense of interdependence, it will be deeply helpful for getting rid of some of the other toxic attributes of aggression and dominance and lack of sort of your being in tune with your own self emotionally, such that we see higher rates of depression and suicide and alcoholism and other sort of coping mechanisms, which really just try to escape from the reality of our fragile and weak lives. So I think regrounding the conversation around how those things cannot be dismissive or negative attributes, but actually essential to our understandings of the fullness of our humanity, would directly influence men as well. And I think that families are communities, sort of micro communities, where I think we get to try to practice that emotional vulnerability. And so one of the things I really liked about Leah's article was when she talked about how this sort of within those micro units, we get the opportunity to be vulnerable, such that we don't have to stand out in the middle of the street and be emotionally vulnerable to everybody right off the bat. We can learn and practice what it means to open up to somebody in love, and to have our weaknesses and our fragility held and not dismissed or thrown back in our faces, but really give us a sort of healthy relationship from which we can then hopefully build on expanding the number of people and the kind of people that we're able to be emotionally available to and vulnerable to. And especially, I loved how she talks about how it influences the way in which we relate to God. Because I do think that the way we live and the way we practice our lives does influence our theological understandings, and vice versa. So if we're constantly pushing back against ideas of dependence or weakness, it will be harder for us to admit and to embody a sense of dependence on God, and a weakness in comparison to one who is almighty, in whose comparison we are all weak and fragile beings. So I think for us as humans, for us as men, there's some deep affinities there. And the article itself tries to ground a healthy idea, or a positive idea of masculinity, in the example of Christ. And I think I would just point out that Christ was, I think theologically this may sound a little bit blasphemous, but in a sense he was dependent, right? He was dependent on Mary. He was dependent on, a place to sleep and food to eat. He came into this world, and to think of God entering this world in a fully dependent fashion, rather than keeping God's independence in the sense of, oh yeah, I just, I don't need to eat or sleep, or, I don't need anybody to talk to. I can just go it on my own because I'm Jesus. He recruited people to come around and be with him, and he sought out other individuals to be a part of his life. So I think there's some real scriptural basis for this, as well as a real need for it in our contemporary society as well. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. And Leah, really appreciate you opening the door to this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Noah. Our next speaker is Atar Hadari. Atar is an award-winning Hebrew literary translator, a poet, a playwright, and historian of English Bible translation. He's written several pieces for Plough, including funeral psalms for my father. Atar, we were talking earlier about the Psalms and how, for example, David's relationship to the Almighty is different from that of Moses or Abraham. Could you go into a little bit of that for us?
Sure. When you asked me to address Leah's theme of dependence, what I thought about was how you have a kind of a line of dialogue between humanity and God, starting with Adam, going on through Noah, going on through Abraham, and through the patriarchs. That is I hesitate to say formal, but there's role playing, you know. God says, don't eat this, and Adam sadly does not quite conform to demands and makes excuses. But there's a formal dialogue. The same formal dialogue happens with Noah. With Abraham, there's actually a confrontational aspect. Abraham takes God to task for presuming to destroy Sodom. And Abraham says, well, hey, you asked me to talk about this. You want me to just let this slide? No, you're out of order here. You're meant to be a judge. How can you just go poof, gone? And he haggles him down to 10. If he could just find 10 decent people in the town, he'll let it go. And that kind of formal moral holding to account is the relationship God also has with Moses. They have, from the moment God taps Moses in the desert to do this impossible thing, which Moses wants no part of and can only just be bullied into, they have very little chit chat. You know, at the very end of Moses' career, Moses says, you know that thing about getting to the promised land, do you think you could maybe just cut me a tiny little bit of slack there, because I'd really love to see what it's like over there? And God's not remotely interested. So, but that is the one moment of personal vulnerability that Moses shows to God. All the rest of the time, he's pleading for the Jews. And that's a big difference when you get to David, because David is constantly being vulnerable in front of God. There's no formality. There's no, how could you be so outrageous as to do this? David, every day it seems like is talking to God and saying, I have problems here. I messed up. Boy, did I mess up this time. God, can you believe what I did? And that is a totally different relationship, which I think is why David is who a Jew prays through all day long is the Psalms. You can't, you know, you may mention Moses, you may mention Abraham, you mention Isaac and Jacob, but you can't get through a page of the prayer book without a psalm, because that's the tool of connection and the language of vulnerability with which you approach the Almighty. And I thought was very interesting about the discussion about toxic masculinity and dependence was the mention of John Wayne. Was that your article, Peter, or was it yours, Noah? And I thought it was amazing that people used John Wayne as a model, because if you look at the John Wayne movies, John Wayne is the example of the, I hate to say, hesitate to use psychoanalysis, but he's the example of the guy who is left behind. And then Jimmy Stewart is the guy who can, you know, build a town. And John Wayne is the guy who shoots people and then cannot live in that town. And it's quite amazing that people dig John Wayne up and say, yes, that was what we used to be like, and kind of ignore the movies that were built around that character. Very subtle, deep, nuanced portraits of how a social entity like a little town works. And John Wayne is not who is in the middle of that town. He's on the very outskirts of that town. And I just want, Leah's article made me think of a psalm that I hadn't translated, and I went to find it and translate it. Psalm 131, which has at its center this image of the there's a word in Hebrew, gamul, which is translated into English, and I couldn't find I've not seen another translation, which is weaned child. The weaned child is the image in the middle of this psalm, and this speaks to what Leah's article was about, because in modern Hebrew, you don't hear that verb or that noun very often. The only context you hear it in is when somebody is no longer addicted to something. They are nigmal. They have stopped being addicted, and that's the only place you hear that verb in modern Hebrew. But in Psalms, David depicts himself as a child lying on his mother, who is God. And he's not lying on God because he's feeding. He's lying on God. He doesn't need to feed anymore, but he's just happy because he's lying next to God. And I thought I'd finish with, if I may, with just to read that little tiny psalm. Is that okay, Ian?
Yes, please do.
So Psalm 131, a song of ascent by David. Lord, my heart didn't get puffed up, and my eyes haven't looked high, and I have not walked like the great and liked things beyond my grasp. Have I not stooped and stilled my spirit like a weaned child on his mother? My spirit is like a weaned child against me. Israel will hope for the Lord from now until the end of time.
Wow.
Thank you.
Tar, thank you so much for that. That is one of my favorite songs, and it's a really fascinating imagery, and also to hear that talk. Thank you so much. Now our final speaker tonight is Peter Mommsen. Peter is Plough Quarterly's editor-in-chief. He's also a member of the Brotherhood Community Movement, and he's the author of the book Homage to a Broken Man, The Life of J. Heinrich Arnold. Peter, in your opening letter, you talk about the way Jesus redefined and extended the idea of family, and about the way the early Christians demonstrated their love for one another and for those around them. And it seems to me the first Christians, far from being autonomous or independent, were bound to each other by a very intense set of obligations, really the obligations of love. So it'd be great if you could talk to us a bit about that.
Yes, and it's so good to be here and so glad to have this event, especially for Plough's readers in the UK and in Europe. And we're so glad you're joining us. And I certainly hope you heed Ian's call to subscribe. Sorry, I just can't help getting in a little plug here. But this is a wonderful conversation. This theme of dependence, the illiberalism of weakness, how Rabbi Hadari just brought out how it impacts our relationship to God, and Noah's comments about how it impacts our view of ourselves as a man or as a woman, seems to me so important, and really does, to your question, Ian, get at what is, from a Christian point of view, important about family. What really is family? You know, when we first started thinking about doing an issue on family, we were aware that even just talking about family can seem controversial, almost like a culture wars word. If you go back, the word family values was invented, I believe, around 1966 to describe a very specific kind of religious and political program, one that was going to halt the sexual revolution, that was going to attack divorce and moral decline, that was going to encourage essentially stable marriages, traditional families, and childbearing. And then there's another kind of family values that you've seen come to the fore, certainly in this country in the last couple of years. In one of the recent events, Leah, I think you mentioned Matt Brunig's Family Fun Pack. On the more leftist side of things, where the reason modern families are in crisis is said to be all kinds of economic attacks, the kind of war of capitalism on families, the way that the workplace makes it so hard for parents, especially those from lower income, to actually be there for their kids or even to have kids in the first place. The pressures for 24-hour work, to constantly reply to those Slack messages from your boss. The necessity of geographic mobility that tears apart extended families, tears grandchildren from their grandparents, again, makes it more difficult to raise kids in that kind of tightly knit way that we like to think of families as having been in the past. So you have this sort of conservative family values, and you kind of have a socialist, you could say, version of family values. Now, as we were thinking about this issue, we kind of felt, are those two narratives actually mutually exclusive? Because as a magazine, we largely affirm big parts of both. And I think this theme of dependence really gets at why those two pieces fit together. I won't get into it completely now, but I think to go to the example of the early church, of course, the early church was a Jewish community in Jerusalem, and we can't get into the full teachings of the Hebrew scriptures on family, but there's two big themes that we can pull out, and one is that family appears very early in the first pages of the Bible, where God creates Adam and Eve, and later it tells them that the man shall cleave to his wife. He sort of gives this divine sanction to the union of a man and a woman for the bearing of children. And then throughout the rest of Scripture, we see the huge importance of genealogy, that we are actually not autonomous. We do not come from nowhere. We depend on and are fitted into and are really defined by where we come from, the long strings of begats that, you know, many kids, when they're given their first Bible, kind of look at and wonder what the heck's going on there. And many Christians might be tempted to think that these are kind of Old Testament things that are sort of done away with together with Leviticus' prohibition on eating shellfish. And yet it's interesting that in the Christian scriptures the Gospels, two of them begin with genealogies, going back to David, going back to Abraham. And of course, Jesus very signally reaffirms the divine sanction for the union of one man and one woman. He says for life in the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of his central saying. But yet Jesus goes on and does one other thing, which is that he then radically decenters the biological family and says, who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters? They're the ones who do the will of my Father who sent me. And so where I see true Christian family values is not being so much, and this is really generalizing, but not being one political narrative or another political narrative, but maybe we can catch a glimpse of it in the book of Acts, the second chapter, where all who believe are as one heart and one soul. They are family to each other. They become brothers and sisters. And that family is not just a kind of moral family or a family of mutual shared sentiment. It's an economic family. They share all things in common. Each one is given what they need. And there's a kind of vision of what true Christian family values are, that the biological family is by no means done away with. And yet there is a deep sense of kinship that is extremely dependent, extremely interdependent. There's one other thing. We're all in praise of dependence and interdependence tonight, but part of that early Christian community is a sense that people are also individuals. And there's a kind of old German saying that's been ascribed to Nietzsche, but I don't think it's really from him. Gemeinschaft macht gemein. Community makes you vulgar, essentially. Too much community is bad for you. You become one of a herd. And there's a sense that in allowing ourselves to be dependent and to really rely on another, we actually come into ourselves as individuals. And so that's one thing I'd love to explore a little more in the conversation, because I think it bears so much on what we've been saying about our relationship to the divine, our relationship to ourselves as man or woman, and our relationship to one another in society. So thanks, and looking forward to our discussion.
That's great. Thank you, Peter. I mean, the first question that I had actually came like going back to Leah, where you make a connection between sort of physical weakness and moral weakness, and is there a sense where we're actually having to be depended on, or conversely being dependent physically? Does that change? Does that change the way we look at moral weakness? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the big gifts of dependence on others, even more so than having others depend on you, is that sense that you can be weak, you can be messy, and that you are still loved. And I think it takes practice to learn that, because we're often in our own pride so ashamed of whatever is weak and is truly, damaging or difficult for other people, that we're reluctant to bring it to God or to bring it to the people who can help us and ask for help. I think it's also comforting to know that we can love people when they're weak. Something that helped me be ready to be a mom was in college, when my then college boyfriend had stomach flu. And I just genuinely didn't know until he had stomach flu what I would do if someone I cared for was throwing up. And I thought, maybe I'll have children, but then they'll get sick and I'll just run out of the house and never come back because it will be too disgusting and I won't be able to cope with it. And, it was a process of just really in the moment, in, the college dorm bathroom stall, thinking, wow, I'd rather be here taking care of this person I care for than be really far away from vomit. That could genuinely be a feeling I had. And that was really important to know that I could be a parent. I think one thing that actually makes it harder for people to consider parenthood is lacking those experiences of caring for someone who's dependent on you, and not in a purely charming way, but in a challenging or, asking you to, deal with things you find disgusting way, and having the lived experience of your love for them outweighing your disgust, and, not erasing your disgust either. But I think without that, again, that sense of what would it be like to have a child is very hypothetical, and you don't know how you'll react. And you can be frightened that you're not equal to it, or you won't love someone enough. So a small bit of practice, having other people depend on you, helps you learn what love really feels like. And being dependent on others lets you know that, you can be mired in something that is difficult and that doesn't negate someone's love for you or isn't necessarily going to outweigh it. And again, without that experience, think about how someone struggling with an addiction to pornography feels, trying to weigh whether to go to a friend and saying, I'd like you to be my accountability partner. I'm having this struggle. I don't know how to step away from it. I want you to, sign up for a program like Covenant Eyes with me to check in on my internet usage, to see when I screw up and to pray with me and help me do better. And I think for many people, since we've been talking about what a positive view of masculinity feels like, that sounds as difficult as, I've had a hospital procedure and I need you to come help me wipe my bottom, right? That both those sound like a strange thing for a guy to ask one of his friends to do, but both might be something where you really need someone's help, and you need to hear people talk about making those kinds of requests and having that deepen a friendship rather than destroy it.
Ian, could I just pick up on that real quickly? Not actually just strictly on the masculinity side, which I think you're right, Leah. But also I think when we get back to the very fundamentals of love as an emotion and also a value and an ethic, it cannot be done in isolation or alone, right? By definition, to love someone or something takes us out of ourselves and puts us in a relationship with another person or thing or whatever it may be, such that if we are called as Christians to love one another, it would seem just a direct call into community, right? Out of independence and into dependence, because love is it flows both ways. It's not just me loving you so that you can have all these nice things from me and feel good. It's that I need to be able to receive as well. And in order to receive, I must be lacking something that I need. And so it opens that up in a way that I think has functional components, but also deeply spiritual and theological import as well. So I think that's essential to our understanding of ourselves as human beings.
This actually ties into the next question I was going to ask, which is much more general. If we can imagine a society where weakness is really appreciated, what would that look like? How would that be different from how we're living now?
Well, I think one piece of it, Ian, is who's at the center of that society. Is it the physically fit, the young, the attractive, the ones who are risen to the top of the meritocracy? Or is it the people that, for instance, Jesus put in the center, literally children, women, those who were outcast? And, you know, this kind of relates to what Leah was telling about earlier. For me personally, a super formative thing was shortly after college, when I was, you know, just really kind of high on myself. I found myself taking care of a quadriplegic young man my own age who needed help with everything, who couldn't speak. In fact, one of my colleagues, Maureen Smunger, wrote a piece about it called "The Teacher Who Never Spoke," because it's her brother. And I was actually with him for four months, 24/7, did everything. And it just reminded me of something you, Leah, said. It's not just that he was a receiver, and this is not sentimentalizing anything about his condition, but it was really through befriending someone I couldn't even speak to, and noticing that after a few months he was happy to see me and glad to have a guy his own age to do stuff with, that I think for the first time appreciated, you know, not in a sort of self-helpy way, but sort of came to accept who I was, right? And realized that being a human being was not about how many successes I notched off, but about being, you know, a child of God who he had a plan for. And so I think who's at the center of a society, who's it built around, who is that society good for, might be one way of answering that question.
I think that's an excellent point. I think one thing I'd expect to see that would be different in a society that really valued the dignity of weakness is, first of all, we'd see different people, that there would be less of an impulse to warehouse people, that there are people who are missing from our society right now because they've been aborted, who would be brought to term and supported by both their families and their communities. You know, it's so different for me when I go to Mass and when I visit the Bruderhof in terms of who I see in the community, people with profound disabilities who are a part of the community, versus in the rest of my life, I often don't see them as often. And so the first thing is just we would see some of the people who are currently hidden from us or who aren't alive, who would be alive in a community that valued weakness. I think the second thing is the kinds of stories we'd tell about our relationships and what's most meaningful in our life would shift. That there would be less of an emphasis on stories of, you know, singular accomplishment and of what we could do, and more of the stories of the type that Maureen told, of the joy of knowing someone, because that is the kind of thing that doesn't depend as much on our strength and really relies on a trust in the truth that everyone God has made and loves is interesting. And is interesting in their particularity. So it isn't just a question of, well, you know, I value weakness, so now I put in the work to take care of people who are weak, and I've done that. They're taken care of. Good job. Because you can't take care of the weak in kind of even just a a machine factory type way. It requires entering into people's individuality. This is something I really admire about the L'Arche communities, which were founded by Sheldon Van Auken, a man who we now know more about the good and evil in his life. But the communities and the people who came to them are still doing good work, and it's about living together as particular people and really entering into the particularity of both the disabled and the able-bodied. And I think the more we put weakness at the center, the more our eyes are drawn to the distinctiveness of individuals, not the autonomy of them, just the distinctiveness, and wanting to say, I wish to know you in particular. I want to know God by knowing who you are. I want to see how he loves you and how he might call us to work together. And that does kind of go in both directions, no matter who has kind of the upper hand in strength in the relationship or who requires more logistically of the other. That desire to know and be known, that part we can approach each other on a position of equality. Oh, shoot, I meant L'Arche founded by Jean van Niel, not Sheldon Van Auken. Sheldon Van Auken is the author of the very beautiful memoir, A Severe Mercy, about whom I know no evil in particular at all.
Thanks for clearing that up, Leah. My next question, actually, we've touched on it, but I think it's a very big one when we're talking about dependence, and that is commitment. It'd be hard to imagine any kind of dependence without there being someone there to be dependent on. And how does commitment play into this?
Well, I suppose part of it has to do with family, right? I mean, this is what we're talking about. What are families for? What are the bounds of our families? Certainly, from a perspective of faith, our family is not merely the nuclear household unit that goes, is reported in tax data. It's should be an extended family, but it's also the family of the faith. And, scripture throughout tells us how we are to treat our brother. That is a family, that's a relationship. You don't sort of enter and exit out of brotherly relationships or sisterly relationships to people. And I think that may be one of the biggest sort of mental shifts that we're, with this event tonight are kind of urging, right? That being a brother, being a sister, thinking of ourselves in that terms and vis-a-vis other people, especially vis-a-vis strangers, requires a complete remaking of that classical Lockean autonomy with which Leah began her remarks. And I was thinking too, I was so moved by Atar, your piece, Funeral Psalms for My Father, and by your words earlier, that Jews pray through David. And of course, David did a lot of stuff as an individual. He was a king. He was a protagonist in the biblical story. But he was only understandable as the leader of a people, as the son of a house, as the father of a dynasty. And so that dependence, that weakness is also in a sort of context of commitment.
I think part of the question is that we have two kinds of commitments: chosen commitments, where we feel like I see someone in need, and although they don't have any unique claim on me, I choose to go to them. And then unchosen commitments, where someone does have a particular claim on you, and it doesn't really matter how you feel about it. And then to a certain extent, it doesn't matter how you respond. The claim exists, and the question is how you respond to it. And families really are one of the big sites of those unchosen claims, where someone can be a lousy brother to you, even a brother whom you can't see because it becomes dangerous, but he doesn't stop being your brother. He can only become a good brother or a bad brother. I think when it comes to that question of commitment to return to the life of King David, before I converted to Catholicism, there was part of his story that I found challenging, which is that when he's called to account for his for his choosing the death of Uriah, for his claiming Bathsheba for himself, that his son dies as the result of his evil. And this kind of points to the question of how is it possible that innocent people can suffer for the crimes of someone else? But part of what a family is that you can't disconnect from other people in your family and still be a family. There's no punishment God could have given David that would have spared his son or spared his family entirely, because the fact of him being a father means that whatever comes to pass in his life, good or evil, has a connection to the rest of his family. And before his evil had ever blossomed into this punishment, the moral evil has a weight on his whole family. It's an unchosen dependence. But our kind of solution to that isn't, well, we want to find a way for a father to commit adultery and to isolate his whole family from the effects of that adultery. We want to find a way for that to be safe, for people to be kept safe from the evil of other people they depend on and they love. And there's no way to do that while maintaining the real connection of a father and his family. And again, that goes back to, why do we need to have practice in bringing our physical and moral weaknesses to each other? And the answer is because it's not as though they're insulated from our moral weakness until we admit it. It's still there. And the more it's kept secret, the more it festers. We have to bring those to each other because we can only deny that they affect the people we love. We can't actually stop it from affecting the people we love and who love us.
That
Oh,
draws
so well put.
I was just going to say, I think that draws on another sort of important aspect of dependence we haven't sort of made explicit, which is honesty, right? It's sort of that we need to be able to be honest with each other. And I think to your question, Ian, about commitments, I think part of the honesty is the fact that we can make these commitments and then we're going to break these commitments, right? Like, we will not live up to our word. We will not be the perfect person we claim we want to be at the outset. Are we in a strong enough relationship with the person we've made this commitment to be honest about the fact that we've broken our commitments and we'd like to continue to try to move forward and reconcile? And I'm thinking even just so much as, yes, I will make sure I bring you dinner on Tuesday, and we forget. And then all of a sudden, how do we respond to that, that of our own failings? And if we're surprised by them or horrified by them ourselves, it'll be that much harder to bring them out to other people and say, gosh, gee, I just got busy and I couldn't be there, and I'm really, really sorry. That to me seems like part of an authentic relationship needs that level of honesty.
That's a really excellent point, Noah. Atar, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
I guess it's whether it's commitment or assumptions. We were talking around the dinner table the other night about a piece of research I read years ago talking about the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, and whether in Israel or elsewhere, have many more kids. And one of the knock-on effects of that is if you have grandma who's lying in hospital between life and death, there is no shortage of people to sit next to the bed and hold grandma's hand and pat it and go, it's okay, grandma, it'll be fine. And guess what? That translates into a much higher statistical likelihood that grandma is going to pull through. And that's that's just a reality of a lifestyle which is makes a lot less sense from a capitalist model, has that benefit. But does the model of the independent nuclear family of 2 parents, 2 kids, ideally 2 cars, ideally 2 garages, that is a value judgment and a set of assumptions about what you need to live and where your obligations end. And I'm not sure that the members of those families would say they had made a commitment. They just were brought up with with a certain set of assumptions and a certain set of relationships that extended beyond those two parents, two kids, and accoutrements. There is a cost to that set of assumptions, but there's also a benefit.
I love that point in the context, especially of medicine and care, where our focus often on caring for the sick is purely physical and purely medicalized. But from my own experience, when getting ready to have a baby, I wanted my husband there to take care of me. And a good friend of mine served as a doula, and doulas who are not medical professionals, but people who are kind to you and attentive to you, which is not actually the job of a doctor in most cases for births. The job of the doctor is to solve any medical crises that come up, but not to be with the woman during labor. The doulas, if they were a drug you could put in an IV, they'd be a huge impact, covered by every reasonable insurer. But because they're a person caring for you, it's not medical care. And it's certainly not covered by anyone because it can't be given in a pill or in an injection. And that a lot of the time when we look at what does it take to care for someone who's sick, we restrict our view to the kind of care that can be given in a professionalized, less relational mode, and not, as you're saying, the things that are making a huge impact in how someone survives or how their recovery goes. Because once it becomes care work and is done in a relational way, we go, well, that's not really medicine, is it?
Okay, we're getting towards the end of this. I would like to, there's actually two questions we've had from the audience. One of them was on my list in any case. And this one is for Noah, specifically. Are there distinctive virtues men should aspire towards in contrast to the distinctive temptations that you've discussed?
Yes, I think so. And in the piece, I take up a few of them, but they're by no means, it's not an exhaustive list. And I think the ones I choose to highlight in my article are compassion, which to me seems sort of the lifeblood of Jesus and his sort of ministry. And then humility. And this, I think, gets into this idea of dependence a little bit when it talks about our a true and honest assessment of who we are and how we relate to others in society, and in a society that promotes the individual above all else and encourages self-promotion above all else. I do think humility is a virtue that would be of great benefit to men, to everyone, but to men in particular, given the particular ways and contexts in which they are formed. And then purpose, this idea of having a sense of energy and spirit and vitality to one's life that sort of propels you into the world and makes you an active participant in it, as well as this sense of the particular purpose of Peter quoted earlier, that my brother and my sisters are those who do, sort of know the will of God and do it. And so to send out into the world with some direction and some motivation to accomplish the good works of God in the world. There are other aspects you can pick up, particularly from Jesus's life, in terms of generosity, again, honesty, fidelity, both in faithful to God and faithful in his relationships to those around him. And there's others as well that are listed sort of within the piece. But those would be ones that I would tend to sort of focus on as virtues worth cultivating and really worth highlighting as particularly important for men, particularly as they encounter whatever it is making it difficult for many men to adjust to life in the 21st century and find their way forward. I think those ancient virtues are actually gonna lead us in a pretty good way. So that's how I'd answer that question.
And then one for Leah. Do you think the negative notions of dependency are universal in the modern age? Or are they more conditioned and specific to the societies and state systems where we live?
I'm going to give a big caveat, which is I'm reluctant to generalize about all of human history, and to guess exactly how distinctive our modern problems are, especially because we always have a more granular sense of our present age and are limited to an extent to know what was it like to be an ordinary person by who wrote down their experiences at that time, whose sources are we reading to understand what did it feel like to be a serf. Well, it depends on when the serfs could read, and then actually told their stories. So my caveated answer is I don't know. I think some of the things I'm most suspicious of in the modern age are a big focus on meritocracy. I've been reading Michael Sandel's book on the tyranny of merit, where a big part of the push there is that the good part of meritocracy is the idea that we want people to get the chance to develop natural talents and have some level of equality of opportunity. And the downside is that the more we kind of found a system on merit as opposed to something relatively arbitrary that we admit is arbitrary, the more people who wind up as the losers in that system are told they lost because they deserve it and because they're less valuable. So I guess that's one of the modern ideas I think is most dangerous here. And we are kind of called to find a way to salvage what's good about not living in a hereditary aristocracy, of not saying, well, I guess that's the only system that preserves some dignity, independence, since we know things are arbitrary or your chances for advancement are already blocked, so we can't judge you too strongly, while reckoning with the real evils of kind of our current ideas. And I think just to jump a little on the John Wayne discussion for fun, I think it's interesting that the kind of successor to John Wayne's stories recently, The Mandalorian, a Star Wars story, that we see a character who's very much modeled on that lone gunslinger. And the kind of story people want to see isn't he's a lone gunslinger, he travels through the world untouched, but more he gets entangled with someone else's need and has to reckon with how to extend his strength to someone else and where to accept vulnerability in order to keep someone else safe. And I think that's a big challenge for men, right? Is that men are endowed with certain strengths, which call them forward to care for others. But the fact of putting yourself in a position of responsibility for others means that you're less and less safe for yourself. You're more and more likely to find yourself exposed because you've extended yourself beyond what you can guarantee. And reckoning with what it means to make bigger promises and then possibly break them because you're not equal to them, but you're willing to take the chance of extending yourself, of making commitments you can't be certain you'll keep because you wish to take responsibility for others, is a lot of where I see positive models of masculinity. And I do recommend the show. It's a show about fatherhood, non-biological fatherhood, of taking responsibility for people who depend on you.
Yeah, Baby Yoda would have saved John Wayne, I think is what we're. But I think you're right, Leah. I think that's a great point, and I think it also. I think that's why at the end of the piece, my particular piece, push us towards this idea of that it actually is harder and takes more courage to live a form of masculinity that is open to the world in the ways that Jesus was open to the world, because he certainly suffered for it, and there is more opportunity for pain. There's less control. There's an increased vulnerability, and that is harder in many ways. And so I think that actually this sort of sense of courage that one needs, emotional, spiritual courage, to proceed in that way is going to require more of us than actually staying in these very limited types of what a man should be in the world that actually end up being very detrimental to men and others as well. So yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, Noah, I think my favorite line from your piece was where you said the world will not reward us for being like Jesus, and it certainly didn't reward Jesus for being like Jesus.
Right. I thought you were going to say it was the opening line, but that.
Well, that was good too. Okay, well, thank you so much for being on tonight. We're going to wrap this up now, and just to remind everybody once again, Plough Quarterly, subscribe, and we will be doing more events. And I hope this year we will do an event where we can actually show up in person and meet each other and have a glass of wine and experience community and dependence. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.